And Laura, on behalf of the virtual summer seminar in entrepreneurship research, I'm very pleased to welcome you. The Dr. Laura Huang, for our audience, is associate professor at the Harvard Business School. She has a PhD from University of California at Irvine and an undergrad and graduate degree in engineering from Duke and an MBA from NCR. So she has, the North American degrees, the European degree, and of course, she now works in the US. Her research, which I was just talking about a few minutes back, is phenomenal. It's very well done research. It's been featured in prominent outlets like the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Nature. She was named one of the best business school professors under the age of 40 by Poets and Quants. So that tells you she's an accomplished scholar as a researcher and as a teacher. Before coming into academia, she's held positions in investment banking, consulting, management, and she is also the author of the new book, Edge, Turning Adversity into Advantage. With that, Laura, welcome.
Thank you. Such a pleasure, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for agreeing to do this for us. And my first question to you, Laura, is how did you get interested in entrepreneurship research? What brought you to sort of becoming a business scholar and an entrepreneurship researcher?
Yeah, so I actually, it wasn't a very direct route. I know sometimes there's people who have had, there's certain people who are like, oh, I've wanted to be a biologist since I was 5 years old, or I wanted to be a doctor since I was 5 years old. I actually didn't know that I wanted to be a professor, and I didn't know necessarily what I even wanted to study. In fact, I sometimes joke that I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. And, and so, I think the path to where I got to where I am now is I had always been good at math. I think partly because my parents had they were like, no Asian child of ours is going to not be good at math. And so it was something that I was always, that I was always drawn to, that I was good at. And for those of you who are like, oh gosh, she was good at math, I actually wasn't very good at anything growing up as a child. So you have to allow me that. I mean, I was painfully shy. I wasn't musical. I wasn't athletic. I really didn't have very much going for me. And so when it came to deciding what to study, I wanted to study either math, but my father was like, well, why don't you study engineering? It's much more applied. And so as you mentioned, I went into engineering. And from that, I realized that I wasn't actually a very good engineer. And so I was just sort of brute forcing my way through. And I did end up getting a degree in engineering. And in fact, I started a PhD program in engineering, but realized that I wasn't very good at it. And so what I really loved about it, though, was the ideas. I loved the ideas. I loved the people side of it. And so I started working on some companies on the side, so doing some ventures on the side, and became really interested in entrepreneurship. But of course, I wasn't able to pursue that because I had all sorts of student loans that I had to pay off. And by this point, I was pulled onto like a technical marketing team, and they sort of were like, go get an MBA. And so I was working in Europe, and they encouraged me to go to INSEAD, which was in Europe. And so there was all of these sort of stops and starts that really was directing me in this direction, but I didn't really quite know that I wanted to do this. And so when I inevitably did go to business school, started working on some research with a professor, it just kind of, it was this match between the quantitative pieces that I did like, but also enough of the ideas and the innovation and the sort of experience that I had had working in entrepreneurship, and it came together. A lot of the questions that I wanted to ask came from things that I had experienced. And so I think that's why I take this perspective where, even though I study entrepreneurship, both you and I actually study it from this perspective of more of the behavioral micro influences of what's happening within entrepreneurship. So even though it's very much seeped in the strategy and the innovation and what's happening, we're looking at the mechanisms, the people pieces of it, and all of that's leading to the ability to come up with a business model or be able to develop your product or service or be able to scale your business. And so that's sort of, again, it's not a very clear answer, but it really paints this like picture of how I indirectly came to be studying this.
I think that's good for our audience to know, because it's surprising how many of us sort of got to academia through an indirect path. So that's good for the audience to know. And it seems you and I have another thing in common, which is I too have an undergraduate degree in engineering. And I too realized that I'm not very good at engineering. So that's another thing in common. And now we both study gender and entrepreneurship.
That's right. That's
so
right.
Figure.
Yeah.
Second question to you is, can you share briefly with us the trajectory from origin to publication of one of your gender entrepreneurship papers? Pick any one paper, and how did the idea come about? How did you find the co-authors? Did the reviewers love it at first glance, or did you run into obstacles or the journey?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so again, like this is sort of, so the honest answer is that I had not actually intended to study gender and entrepreneurship explicitly. I had always been interested in disparities and disadvantages, and I started out studying. My dissertation was on gut feel and how investors make decisions. And what I realized as I started doing this research is that there are differences in terms of who gets funding and who doesn't, because of things like signals and perceptions and cues and these sort of implicit factors. And when I started looking into this more, I realized that there were a variety of different stereotypes that lead to these differences and disparities in who gets funding and who doesn't. And one of the most prominent ones was based on gender, but there's also lots of other signals based on race, ethnicity, accent, communication, all of these different things. And so that's how I started looking, that's how I initially started looking at gender. And so what I'll share is sort of a paper that brings that a little bit together, where when I first started studying entrepreneurship, I actually wanted to study accent. And the reason why I studied accent first is because I'm the child of immigrants, right? So I have dual citizenship. I'm not, I'm a first generation. And so, when I was growing up, what I found was that both my parents, both my mother and my father, I saw them as I was growing up, time and time again, getting turned down for promotion after promotion after promotion. And I remember during one of those promotions that my father didn't get, that the person who was promoted over him, the person who became his boss, that my father was actually doing that person's job for him, because everyone in the organization sort of knew that that person wasn't qualified and that my father was more qualified. And so I asked my father, and again, I was too young to really understand things around bias or discrimination or stereotypes or any of these things, but I remember asking my father, why is it that you think you didn't get that promotion? And he said, oh, I don't know, it's probably because of my accent or the way I communicate or something like that. And so when I much later, many decades later, became a researcher, that was one of the things I wanted to study. I wanted to study, could it be that based on someone's accent or the way that they communicate, that they would be less likely to get a raise or a promotion or get hired into a top management team position or get funding for their venture or whatever that outcome is. And I found in study after study after study that yes, in fact, based on someone's accent, if they didn't have a standard American accent in the United States, that they would be less likely to get all of these sort of things. And so that was one of the first things I studied. And much later, I continued to be interested in these communication skills and accents and things like that. And so this paper that I recently, that recently came out, or it will be coming out in the June issue of, in one of the June issues, is that that men and women actually have inherently different ways that they communicate, especially in a context like entrepreneurship, where women are more likely to speak concretely, right? They're more likely to talk about the details of something. And especially in an entrepreneurship context, it's because they're trying to be credible. They're trying to give all of the details, all of the things that they've been trying to accomplish. They want to establish that they are credible and legitimate. And so they sometimes will stay very much at that concrete level. Whereas men are more likely to talk in the abstract, to talk about the vision or talk about, and what I found was that what happens is that what entrepreneurs do is that they make assumptions based on whether someone's speaking more concretely or abstractly. And the fascinating thing that I found is that in entrepreneurship, investors are looking for scalability. They're looking for companies that are going to grow and scale in a big way. And so people who talk abstractly talk in a big way. And so they make this link between someone who talks abstractly, even though they're not giving a lot of the details. They fill in those details and assume that this company is going to be really scalable and high growth. And so that leads to these disparities. And from the perspective of the communication and from the perspective of gender, I found this to be particularly salient for men versus women, for male versus female entrepreneurs. But in fact, it's not just male versus female investors. I also find that this is the case based on things like race, ethnicity, all sorts of other characteristics that people might be judged on. And so that's kind of how the idea came about. In terms of the trajectory, I mean, I have never had an easy paper. I don't know if you have, but I hope you have. But I hope you have. But I feel like, you know, the thing that you hear these like, oh, like I submitted that paper and I got a minor revision and then it was like, I have never had that ever in my life. So I feel like every single paper has been like, I finished the paper and I'm like, dragged out and beaten and bloody and like, you know, and by the time I finished the paper, I'm like, do I even like, is there still something in this paper that I love, or has it all been beaten out of me by this point? So I think in terms of the trajectory, it's never really pretty. The particular paper that I'm talking about right now, I started out with two co-authors. They're both social psychologists. Priyanka Joshi, who got her PhD from USC, and Cheryl Waxlack, who was one of her committee members at USC. And they were a part of this. They were a part of this paper because I really valued what they brought in terms of. So Cheryl studies construal level theory, so the difference between concrete versus abstract speech. And so from the theoretical perspective, I thought that was really something valuable to have. And so I think when I'm looking to co-author, I do look at skills and what people bring to the paper. But I gotta tell you, as I get older, it's less about the skills and more about people that I just want to work with. Like I want to work with friends and people that I have fun with. And even if their research is totally in a different area, I find that you find that small sliver of that Venn diagram that overlaps. And if you work with people that you have fun with, it's just so much better. Like again, like hopefully none of you have had this experience, but there's definitely been co-author experience that I've had that I'm like, oh, this is like, you know, they're just so painful. And so you just can't wait for it to be over. Or even when it's over, you're like, oh, never again. And so I think, that's how I find my co-authors, or I agree to work on papers only after I think to myself, will I love working with this person? Like, will I, and I spend more time interviewing babysitters for my kids than I do deciding, than I did early in my career deciding like who I would co-author with. And that co-author experience sometimes lasts like years and years and years, whereas a babysitter is like, they babysit for you for a couple of months and then they go off and do something else because so I do that is something that I think with every paper now I spend a lot of time. So did I answer your question?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
The one part of it I want to sort of follow up on is what about the journals? Like, did you have to go through ups and downs to get it accepted? This paper
Oh
that you
yeah,
were just
yeah.
talking about?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so so you mentioned so you mentioned the book that recently came out. In the book, I talk about how I talk about 18 rejections. So in the my book is called Edge: Turning Adversity into Advantage. So I talk lots about the adversities that I face, and one of the adversities that I talked about is going through 18 rejections, like 18 paper rejections. And so rejection is just part of it. Is part of it. It's so painful, and you know, and so with this paper in particular, we first submitted it to a psych journal. It was first in a psychology journal, and then I quickly realized that I have no idea how to write for a psych journal, so that was just not gonna, like, it just wasn't gonna work. So we and I like in the beginning I was like, oh, psych papers, they're so short, they're so like like we can do this, and I have two co-authors that are social psychologists. But I very quickly was like, nope, that's not going to work. And then we submitted it to organization science. I don't know how many of you are in like squarely in the field of management, but then we submitted it to org science, and we got an R&R. And then we got another R&R, and then they were like, oh, we think this paper should be centered in this and this. So we rewrote it again. And then they said, then we got it rejected. They said, this paper is such a different paper that we don't know what to do with it. And now it's already in like the third round of revisions. And so, that's just part of it. Like that's part of, that's part of the field we're in, right? And it's so painful, but you're just sort of like, okay, what am I going to do? And so, there's like probably a week or two where I'm like, okay, forget it, just let's throw this paper away, let's just not do it, I'm done, it's fine, we gave it our best shot, let's just call it quits. And I have done that with papers, and I can talk about that later if you'd like. But for this particular paper, we did pick ourselves back up, and then we submitted it to AMJ and Academy of Management Journal, and it ultimately was published in Academy of Management Journal after a number of different rounds. So there are rejections. I think the rejections after you've gotten like 2 R&Rs are particularly painful. The way I think about it is like, if you get rejected in the first round, yeah, it's not great, right? But it's sort of like you go on a date with someone and they don't like you. You've been on a first date and you're like, okay, right? Like it wasn't a match. But if you've gone on like 2 or 3 dates with somebody and then they're like, nah, then it's like, it's a little bit more painful because you're like, they've gotten to know me. And so that's why I always feel like after like the second R&R or even the first R&R, it's more painful because they've already asked you out on another date. And now you're like, wait, you asked me out because there's something you liked. And now all of a sudden, so it's a little bit more, it hurts a lot more.
It certainly does. I agree with you. I would love to follow up with you on that, on the co-author thing, but I'll move with the set questions I have.
Sure.
Because the co-author thing you said really resonated with me. I think that's true for all of us who've been doing this for some time. And maybe there's an AOM, PDW that we need to do on how to find good co-authors versus bad co-authors. So yeah. But as a reviewer, and I'm assuming you review plenty of papers in gender entrepreneurship, how do you decide if a paper has potential or not? What do you look for?
I don't think any paper, like there's no perfect paper. I'm actually a pretty lenient reviewer, but don't all suggest me as reviewers now, because I said that I'm actually a pretty lenient reviewer. So what I do is if I see that there's something in the paper that resonates with me, like if I see, for example, even so one example is like, I see something in the data, right? I see something in the data, I see an interesting finding, but yet the paper doesn't actually highlight that, or it doesn't talk about that as the theoretical contribution, or it doesn't really show, that's something that I'll then put in my reviewer remarks. I'll say like, this is where I saw something really interesting, or vice versa. If I'm like, there's something in the theory, there's something really interesting here, but it doesn't really fit what your data is. So I always look for whatever that glimmer is. And if I see something shiny and interesting, I will try my best to give it a shot, like try my best to help them rework it. It's hard in reviewing papers because you can't have that conversation, right? It's one dimensional. So I can't ask the authors like, what did you mean here? What was it that you were trying to? So I think what would be more helpful, even more than what do I look for in a paper, I'll tell you a couple of the things that are the deal breakers for me, the ones that are when I'm like, okay, I can't do anything with this. So there's when the theory and the data are so disconnected that I can't make that connection. Like they're claiming all of these things that they're contributing, but I can't see that in the data at all. Like the data there's no way for me to understand the data in such a way that it helps me understand the arguments that they're making. That's extremely difficult. So there has to be a fit between, and this is for empirical papers, right? For conceptual theoretical papers, it's different. And then I think the other big thing that I see in a lot of papers that I review is that there's too much. Like, I think the tendency is that we see these papers and they're big, sophisticated papers with lots of complicated language. And it's like, sometimes they're even hard to read, right? I see papers that are published and I'm like, what? Like, this is so, the language is so obscure and it's so difficult. I'm like, this is what they want, right? And so then we think that when we're writing papers, we have to do the same thing. We need to have like all of these really, we have to have all of these big, huge ideas and lots of different theories. And that actually is a big detriment. Like if you have more than one or two theoretical bases that you're drawing from, it's too much. You don't have the ability to kind of tie together 4 or 5 different literatures. Like you can't be tying in transaction cost economics and construal level theory and like, stereotype theory and all these different things all at once. So you have to have a foundation. You have to say like, my paper is grounded in X. And then the other things you sort of lightly bring in order to explain your arguments as you go along. And so that's like, I think as a reviewer, something that I see a lot. And I think I especially see it in like doctoral students and very, very early career scholars, because I did it myself. Like I remember when I was writing my dissertation, it was this like more, like keep putting more. And then what happens is you go crazy because your head can't control, you can't manage all of that all at the same time. And so then you're just like, I don't even know where to start. I don't know how to write this. I'm so overwhelmed that I can't. And then like papers end up becoming this big mishmash of lots of things. And so I think that's another thing that I look for. And so those reviews, I tend to say, I explicitly will say there's like too much here. Like you need to focus in on this theory. And I think this theory that you wrote about, but those papers unfortunately are often rejections because I don't know what to do with it. Like, I don't know, I can't direct it in a certain way. I can't see what that revision is going to look like. So I think that's probably one of the biggest things.
And what you said about some papers being highly complicated resonates completely with me. Sometimes I read a doctoral student paper and I have no idea what they're saying after 3 lines.
Yeah.
Because the language is so obscure and they're trying to mix in so many different ideas in one sentence. Yeah. That I'm lost. And so that.
And they're trying to come up with like new terms and new constructs and like, and those constructs, I'm like, you don't need to invent a new name for something, but we sort of feel like we do. Like we need to have like, some fancy word for, but unless it's really not out there already, you don't need to invent a term. There are ways to to theorize without doing so.
Yes, so that's very good advice. For my fourth question to you is, and I see that there are questions from the audience also, but we'll come to that after sort of my question. Can you tell us about one gender entrepreneurship paper you're working on these days? How did you get the idea, where you are on that paper, and what's your plan for it?
So so my papers tend to be very clumpy. What I mean by that is, like, sometimes I have lots of ideas all at the same time, and then I'm like, oh, I get very ambitious, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to do this paper and this paper and this paper, and then there are other times where I'm like, whoa, I have like nothing in my pipeline. I have nothing, like, so I think this past year has been the latter, where I'm like, I don't know what it is that I want to study. I'm not sure what I'm interested in. I still am interested in gender and in entrepreneurship. But I have to tell you, and this goes back to the reviewer question as well, I've reviewed so many papers recently that are about gender and entrepreneurship, and all of the conclusions of the papers inevitably are women entrepreneurs are less successful than male entrepreneurs. And I'm sort of thinking, we know this, like, this has been studied, we know this, right? And so unless you're going to have some big different way of understanding why that is, or some solution around why that is, I feel like that's sort of overdone, and there's a new direction that we need to take in terms of understanding gender, in terms of understanding entrepreneurship. So, you know, I'm doing more, I think, now with, you know, still within entrepreneurship, but more looking at the uncertainty and a different aspect of a different contextual piece of entrepreneurship. I've always been fascinated by the fact that entrepreneurship is highly uncertain, that there's a lot of risk. I did a project recently where we purposely wanted to see, my co-authors and I, and this is an example of working with people who are not, who you traditionally wouldn't think would be overlapping with you at all. So I worked with two basically like econometrics superstars, and most of my work is multi-method. Like, I do qualitative, I do experiments, I do field work, and I started working with with Brad Greenwood and Seth Carnahan, who both of them I love, like, I adore both of them. They both do macroeconomics and very, you know, modeling and these sort of things. And what we started talking about was, well, hey, we should find a circumstance in which no bias exists, right? Like, let's start there. Let's start with a context where there's no bias, and let's contrast that with entrepreneurship, where we've shown that, where, like, in my work and in your work and lots of people's work, we've shown that there's lots of disparities and biases and disadvantages. So what we did was we started looking at things like, you know, all different contexts, trying to identify where bias would not exist at all, because that was our, like, that was our straw man, that was our, and so we're like, well, what about, like, in emergency rooms, right? A doctor barely even knows who the patient is. Like, the patient comes in, they're having a heart attack, and the doctor's just trying to save their life, right? They've taken the Hippocratic Oath. There should be no differences in terms of whether men or women survive heart attacks. And that's like we're controlling for things like, you know, gender differences in terms of, you know, health and all, we're controlling for everything. And so there should be no difference in terms of whether a male or a female survives. And so we thought that that was going to be our baseline, that we could show that. And then on top of that, we could build different arguments. And what we found was that, in fact, there are disparities. So this is a paper that was published in a journal called Proceedings of National Academies of Science. It's not a management journal. But what we show is that when women are treated by so basically, there's a congruence effect where if you look at male physicians treating male patients versus male physicians treating female patients versus female physicians treating male patients and female physicians treating female patients, that there's a difference, and that that women are actually more likely to die Now, this doesn't mean they're more likely to die in general, but the delta, they have a decreased propensity for survival when their physician is not the same gender as them. And so it's like, we were like, what? And again, and so this was a paper that we're tying to the entrepreneurship perspective now, where we're kind of looking at this implicit piece of it, because that makes no sense at all, really. And again, you can imagine we had to do months and months of robustness checks, like checking everything from, the time the patient was admitted, to who the doctor is, to the education of the doctor, to everything, because you have to rule out every single confound other than the fact that it's this match in gender. So that review process was brutal, but that's sort of like what and again, like you can get through those brutal review processes when you're working with people that you really love and that you have fun with, and that you trust, and you don't ever have these like, oh, like they're not doing any work and I'm doing all the work, or like they're doing all the work and I feel guilty that I'm not doing enough of the work, or like any of these sort of dynamics. Like there's just none of that. And so when you find co-authors like that, you really want to like hold on, because that's exactly what makes it fun again, because there's so many downs in this career that you have to like cling on to as many of the ups that you can.
And I'm glad you emphasized again how difficult it is to find good co-authors for every one of us.
Oh, so hard. And I think it changes over time. Like I do think like, it changes over time, and it's really hard. And so, you definitely, it is a difficult piece. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, as you can see, we have lots of people who want to ask questions. So we are going to turn to the audience now.
Sure.
Glory, do you want to start?
Yes, please. Good afternoon, Laura. Okay, let me put on my video. Okay.
Hi.
Can you see me?
Yeah. Hi.
How are you doing? Okay, so I'm calling from Lagos, Nigeria. Very excited to be here. I took your course on entrepreneurship from the Wharton. When you were at Wharton, I did a
Coursera course. Yes.
Yes, I loved it. It was very exciting. Thank you. Okay,
Sure.
so I have 3 questions. Pardon me, I'm a bit of an Oliver Twist. So the first question is actually an idea for a potential paper that you might find interesting. So according to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, African women lead the world in entrepreneurship. So of all the continents, African women start the most businesses. And to me, that's the classic example of turning adversity into advantage, because it's the poverty, right?
Yeah.
That really forces women to take the risk and start their businesses. So I don't know, it was just an idea I wanted to throw out. If it's something you want to pursue, or you need data, that might be an interesting topic. And secondly, I applied. I was considering applying to HBS for my PhD. I spoke to Josh Lerner. He's your colleague, the investment banking faculty, but he kind of confused me. He said that if you want to do entrepreneurship at Harvard, you either apply to the business economics PhD, the economics PhD, or the government PhD. And I wanted to study entrepreneurial mindset, right? So that's more like behavior. And I didn't really see how it would fit in. So I know I'm in a program right now, but I just thought, maybe for someone else, is it possible to apply to the organizational behavior PhD and still focus on entrepreneurship in Harvard? And then the third one is, I see you won the 2013 award for the best dissertation at the Academy of Management. So if you can give us some tips, I think that was your doctoral dissertation and you won an award for that. So if you can give it, we're all writing dissertations and we'd love to learn, what are some tips on how we can write a good one. So thank you very much.
Sure. Okay, I'll do, so the first, for your first point, I've never been to Africa. I've never been to Nigeria. I've read a number of books that are based in Nigeria, so I've always wanted to go. So if that's an invitation, Glory, someday I will take you up on that. I would love to go to Nigeria someday.
Sure.
And yes, I agree. I think that there's so many different definitions of entrepreneurship, and we tend to focus on one specific definition of entrepreneurship, which is this high growth, high tech, high scale type of entrepreneurship. But there's so many different forms, and those are very much opportunities for ways to study them in the future. The sad part of that is that because people are not studying it, there's a bigger hurdle. But I'll get to that in a second when I talk about my dissertation. The second piece in terms of the PhD program. So, the PhD program, I think PhD programs at every school are very, very different. I think in general, it's always more difficult when you're crossing crossing over in terms of disciplines. So my PhD was similar. I studied organizational behavior and entrepreneurship, and so I think I'm not exactly sure. I'm actually currently in the organizational behavior unit at HBS, but when I was at Wharton, I was in the entrepreneurship department. And so I can tell you that this cross-disciplinary thing gets very, very confusing, because I remember this week where a couple of years ago, where I had been invited to a couple of different schools to give talks. And I had, so one day I was giving a talk at the Duke strategy unit, which is very, very macro. Their strategy unit is, they're studying, anyways, it's very macro. And then the very next day I was giving a talk at Michigan, which was and they're like social psychologists, and it was the exact same paper that I was presenting. And so I think people in the field sometimes are confused as well. So in terms of the PhD, I don't actually know. My answer is I don't know. I do know that it is tricky because the way that they do doctoral students, the ones who come in studying entrepreneurship typically have much more of that macro perspective. I'm probably the only one who has that micro perspective, and that's why I'm in the organizational behavior unit, but I'm not on the admissions side. So I think from the OB side, they look for something very different. So I can talk with you more about that, but I think it is very confusing. I don't quite understand it myself. And I should say that I actually was rejected from the Harvard PhD program myself. So there's no shame in getting rejected. I was actually rejected from Harvard 3 times. I was rejected from HBS for the MBA program, for the PhD program, and as a rookie coming out on the job market, I was rejected then as well. So so if you've been rejected, just brush it off, right? Like, it's fine. One day they'll be calling you and telling you to come teach for them. Okay, and then your third question, in terms of the dissertation, this one's a little bit longer, but I'll try and give a concise answer so we have time for other questions too. But when I was working on my dissertation, I got a lot of advice. One of the pieces of advice that I got was, do not study gut feel. This is the worst potential topic ever. You're never going to get a job. You're never going to be able to publish this. Gut feel is a slang term, and no one is going to think a term like gut feel, which is a slang term, is theoretically rich enough to publish. Luckily, I had an advisor who said, don't listen to any of them if this is what you want to study. And I studied it anyways. But I also knew when I was finishing my PhD program that there was a very high likelihood that I probably was maybe not going to get a job, or if I did get a job, that it was going to be at a very, that it was going to be like at a pure teaching institution that never cared about research. It would never care about my research. And so when I was on the job market, it was extremely frightening, because I also didn't come from a PhD program that is highly respected. It's fine. I'm very proud of where I got my PhD from UC Irvine, but to this day, I have colleagues who will introduce me and will say, oh, and Laura, she got her PhD from UC Berkeley. And I'm like, no, not Berkeley, Irvine. And they're like, Irvine? I thought it was Berkeley. And I'm like, no, Irvine. And they're like, where's Irvine? It's just not on the same, it's not on the same radar. And I didn't have a super famous advisor. I just didn't have any of the, but I will say that because I had a very unique dissertation, that there were a lot of schools that were like, who is this person studying gut feel? That's really not something that people are studying. And that actually gave me an advantage, where even though the brand and all of the other stuff were maybe not enough to get me noticed, that my dissertation did get me noticed. The last thing I'll say about that is it wasn't that I got interest all across the board. So what I found that was interesting was that because I studied this topic, and I wasn't really sure that I was even going to get a job anywhere, I applied really broadly. So I actually applied to 38 different schools for an assistant professor position. And I applied for everything from the top 10 research institutions like HBS, which I got rejected from, all the way down to like Bunker Hill Community College, right? Like everything from, the top tier research institutions all the way to just purely teaching schools that would never even look at my research. And what I found was that it was very bifurcated. I got lots of interest early in the job market from these teaching schools. And they brought me in for job talks, for interviews, because they just wanted to see whether or not I could teach. They really didn't, they didn't care that I had 0 publications, and I had 0 publications going onto the job market, which again, everyone's like, oh, like, oh my gosh, the horror. You had no, how horrible, right? Like you had no publications. So, so I had lots of interest from teaching schools who just wanted to see whether or not I could teach. And then and then there was like a 2 or 3 month period where it was like crickets. I heard nothing, because none of the schools that were sort of in the 20 to 50 or 20 to 100 rankings were interested, because they wanted some sign of credibility. They wanted a publication. They wanted to see that I had come from some sort of a brand name. They wanted to see something. And then all of a sudden, I got lots of interest from people who were like in the top 20, because they didn't actually care that I didn't have publications. They're like, who's this interesting person who's studying gut feel? Well, let's bring her in and see what she has to say. And it's no skin off our backs if she doesn't end up publishing anything, because we'll just like kick her out and bring the next person in, right? And so it was a very strange kind of thing. But you have to be ready for that high risk, high reward type of strategy if you're going to do what I like. And what most of us do, which I totally understand, is we take that conservative route. We try and take that route that'll insure us with something. And I've always been a big risk taker. And so I was like, whatever, like, I'm going to take a risk here. And if it doesn't work out, I'll go back into industry. I'll do something else, but I have to give this a shot. And I had already worked for more than a decade before I went to get my PhD. So I think that was also different. Whereas I had, one of my best friends from the PhD program, he was like, if I don't get a job, I have to go back to dealing poker tables, right? He was a poker dealer before getting his. So there's like, you have to, there's nothing wrong with weighing your own reality and trying to understand what it is you want and what you're willing to take. And so I think that's one of the reasons why my dissertation did win these types of awards, because it was different. It was fresh. It was evaluating things from a very different perspective. And I got very, very lucky, because I happened to fall on that side of it, where I very easily could have fallen on the side of, this is, and I did get that feedback. I will say that there was feedback that I got early on, which was like, some people, I had an anonymous reviewer who's like, you wasted my time in asking me to review this paper. This paper doesn't even belong in, like, we don't know who this person is, but she doesn't belong in academia. Like, she is like, so I definitely got those comments as well. Yeah. I
think some people should be filtered out of the review process. I've gotten those comments too, and I'm like, the editor should have filtered out these people. But Laura, I know we are already past the time you promised us. Is it okay to go 10 more minutes? Because there's
let's go 10 more minutes, because I only got a chance to get one question. So as long as all of you are okay, I'm happy to take a couple more questions.
Yeah, so Vrinda, you want to go next?
Yeah, hi, good morning and good evening from India. I loved the way, Dr. Huang, you you put it so simply, and I know it's not. So I am an early stage scholar, and my question is in terms of method, in terms of the way you selected the methods, in terms of experimentation, and the sheer analysis and the depth that you went for. So how do you select the method and the methodology? That's one.
So I actually don't select the methodology. So there's lots of different perspectives on this. And again, you should get lots of different people's opinions on this, because different people do it very, very differently. I ask the question. So if there's a question that I'm really interested in, I ask that question, and then I ask myself, how am I going to find the answer to this? And sometimes the answer to it means that it needs to be a field experiment. Sometimes it means that it has to be, survey and questionnaires. Sometimes it's interviews and qualitative data. Sometimes it's all three, and that's when I get the multi-method papers. And so it's really about the question that I ask. But what I tell my doctoral students is that one of the things that they need to figure out about themselves and their identity is, what do they care about in terms of topic, and what if we take the continuum of methods, everything from purely qualitative to experiments, field experiments, archival data, to large scale, you're combining data sets, all along the continuum. You have to know where you sort of fit and what your band is. And so what I mean by that is you can stretch within, but I will never be like, my home is never going to be in combining data sets and looking for identification, and I can do it, but that's not where I want to be. Those are not the types of questions. And so my band is so my multi-method band is within a certain area, and I know that. And so those are the types of questions that I ask, and that's how I decide the methods.
Right.
Great.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda. We'll move to the next question. Jadwiga, do you want to go next?
Thank you so much, and thank you for all your insights. I have two kind of intertwined questions into two questions, if I may. It really resonates with me, your story coming from industry to academia. I wonder how this transition was for you in terms of mindset and different way of thinking and working, and thinking there's no politics, but in the end there is politics. And then coming out of that question, in a way, how did you deal on the way when you were entering PhD and then finishing it with this events of adversity that kind of questioned your path? You were so sure of, but there were certain events that you have as fallback into industry that you don't want to take because you believe in yourself, but there are certain events of adversity that question your path. That would be very inspirational for me to hear as a second-year PhD student.
Yeah. So when I first, so I'll talk first so when I first finished, when I was starting my PhD program, and I mentioned earlier that I had worked for, more than a decade, almost a decade before going to get my PhD. My first thought, to be honest, was like, wow, I wasted so much time. Like, I'm so behind. Like, I'm trying to get my PhD, and I'm here with people who are 22 years old. And they're getting right. So I'm so behind. I wasted so much time by the time I'm like, but looking back now, I'm so grateful. I think you're just you're a different type of scholar. You're a different type of teacher. You're a different type of person. And so I'm really grateful that I had spent that time in industry, and I had lots of different careers, right? Going back to the very first question, like, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, right? I worked as an engineer. I was in new product development. I was in consulting. I worked in investment banking for a couple of years, trying to pay off debt. I worked in everything. I worked in so many different industries. And I think that I think some of the people who are the most interesting in the world are the ones who have done lots of different things. So that goes to some of your other questions, right? In terms of like politics, in terms of adversity, in terms of my path long term. Yeah, there is a lot of politics. There's, in fact, I think that there is just as much politics in academia as there is in industry. It just comes in a different form. And it comes in a different form because a lot of the people in academia haven't spent time in industry. And so that changes the dynamics of it. And so there's lots of different ways that I do question my path. Like, again, kind of going back to your original question, like I would say the first 2 years of my PhD program, I had 1 foot in and 1 foot out. Like, I still kept 1 foot in my industry connections because I wasn't sure that I wasn't going to go back. I wasn't positive that I wanted to be all in with academia. And so, but I remember like in my 3rd year, I was like, I can't keep doing this, right? Like I can't keep doing this. So I need to give this a shot, right? It's again, like, I don't know why I'm talking about so many dating analogies because I've been married for over 15 years, but I'll use a dating analogy anyways. It's sort of like if you don't really commit, you're always thinking about, you know, your ex-boyfriend and you're with somebody else. Like you have to decide, am I going to go back to the ex-boyfriend because I think he's better? Or am I going to really give this a shot with this new person that I'm with, right? Okay, so that's sort of the analogy. And so I remember in my 3rd year being like, okay, I can't keep doing this. And so I was like, I'm going to just make that choice and I'm going to be all into academia and I'm going to face the consequences if I fall flat on my face. And again, I'm a big risk taker, so I was completely at peace with doing that. And then the final piece of it is, you know, there's always going to be adversity, and so I still question my path. Like even though I was all in, and there honestly are days where I'm like, you have to not be afraid to start all over. In anything that you're doing, you have to not be afraid. And there are definitely, you know, some people ask me, they're like, well, why did you leave Wharton to go to HBS? I mean, one of my friends was like, why are you trading in your Rolls Royce for a Bentley, right? Like, and I said, you know, because I need a change. Like I need, and so you have to be willing to, and it might not work out for me at HBS, in which case I need to be okay with the fact that I may leave, or I may leave academia entirely, and that might be a fun challenge for me. And so when I question my path, I really truly believe that it's okay, and that, you know, and I tell my students this sometimes, that I could throw them in a ditch and they would still find their way out and be successful. And we all have to believe that about ourselves. We're not starting over. We're not starting over because we have so much experience. We're not starting over. We're doing something new with all of this experience. And so if it means that I'm completely starting over, or I'm leaving and going to a different career, that's totally okay. And that actually, in questioning my path, allows me to be much more secure with my path.
So Laura, in the interest of gender equality, we are now going to let a guy ask a question because it's all been women so far. So Ashish, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, sir. Good evening, Dr. Laura. So my question is that most of the research talk about inefficiency or incompetencies of the women. So I just want to know your views on what are the competencies or skills possessed by a woman that can be beneficial for as an entrepreneur. I mean, what are the distinctive qualities women possess which can support them or help them in excelling business compared to men?
So, you know what I find, which is interesting, is that, you know, we have all these stereotypes of men and women. And, you know, a lot of the perceptions and attributions that we make are based on these stereotypes. And so your question is sort of like, but what I actually find is that about 70 to 75% of these perceptions and these judgments are based on stereotypes, which is large. But what that also means is that there's a 20 to 25%, a large 25, between 20 to 30%, a large 20 to 30% that has nothing to do with stereotypes. It's all based on individuals, your individual characteristics. And what I mean by that is I could take another woman who's Asian, who's a professor, and myself, and we would have very different perceptions bestowed upon us from all of you, right? And so yes, there's that 70%, but there's also that 30%, that 25 to 30%. So the answer to what is it is understanding what is that 70%. And how do you use that 25, the 20, 25, 30% to really inform those stereotypes? And that is something that I explicitly wrote about in my book. That's how you turn an adversity into an advantage. That's how you gain an edge for yourself. That's how you take the obstacles, the constraints, the stereotypes that people have against you and flip them in your favor. And so specifically to your question, women should be taking those same stereotypes and flipping them in their favor by taking those and taking those sort of positive and negative manifestations and flipping those negatives into the positives. And so I outline lots of different practical ways that we can do that. That would be like a whole nother hour session at least, but I talk about ways that we can actually do that. And it's not just for women. Again, it's for any perceptions that are being bestowed upon us, regardless of who we are. Everyone has something. You can be the epitome of white cis male privilege and people are still bestowing perceptions upon you based on your education or your country of origin or any sort of things. And so how we actually manage that is so critical. So,
Laura, I want to be respectful of your time. Are we able to do more questions?
I have about 30 seconds. I have 2 more minutes before my next meeting. So, but I want to give you the last question. So if you have any last lingering questions, I'm happy to sort of answer.
So is it okay if our audience sort of reaches out to you afterwards, maybe LinkedIn or email with their questions?
So yes, I'm so findable on so I have so I'm on Twitter. My handle is Laura Huang, LA, for anyone who's on Twitter. I'm also on Instagram for any of you that are more visually inclined. I'm not very good at Instagram though. I think as professors, we're not good at taking pictures of ourselves and all that, but I am on Instagram. And then I have a website. So any of you who want to sort of, so I have things like, I have a monthly newsletter where I talk about lots of tips and tactics and new research and things that I'm working on. So you can sign up for my newsletter if you go to my website, laurahuang.net. And then since we're all sort of in academia and in the academy, hopefully I run into many of you either at future conferences or, you know, at some point. So please, if you see me, remind me that we met in this venue, and come say hello. I would be very, very glad to meet any of you in person. So.
And Laura, before we let you go, my last question that I ask to everyone: what's the one advice you would offer to aspiring entrepreneurship researchers?
Oh, specific to entrepreneurship researchers or specific to life?
Entrepreneurship researchers.
Entrepreneurship researchers. Entrepreneurship is difficult, right? Because it is, it's grounded in lots of different disciplines: psychology, sociology, economics, strategy. It doesn't have its own discipline. So make sure that you understand the perspective that your work is coming from. Is it coming from a disciplinary perspective, the contextual piece, or is it coming, or is it the disciplinary perspective or the contextual piece? And that'll help guide the way you think about your questions and your research.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And
thank you all. Good luck.
Thank you and have a great day. And we are so glad you were able to join us.
Take care. Thank you all. Bye-bye.